About 5 years ago, my sister, a friend of mine, my girlfriend, and I decided to take a trip to Sierra County, California, deep in the mountains near a small town called Downeyville. We were heading to a brewfest in town and chose to camp rather than book a hotel. We took a road called Kalita, also known as Forest Road 25, which eventually becomes Forest Road 55, looking for an off-grid camping spot. We drove about 7 miles up this road from the main road leading to Downeyville, which was at least 5 or 6 miles before reaching the town. There wasn't much out there except for a few campsites right off the main road. We hadn't gone much farther when we found a clearing among the trees and decided to set up camp. As we were finishing setting up around sunset, an older woman suddenly appeared, walking into our camp from the woods. She was dressed in what looked like hippie-style clothing, probably around 60 years old, frail and small with brownish-gray hair. My first thought was how strange it was because there were no cars or other signs of people anywhere on this road. I asked her what she was doing up there, and she said she was camping just on the other side of the creek with her husband. Then she asked if we had any water, which seemed odd given how far we were from civilization. We gave her some water, and she then asked for a cigarette. I asked if she had come from Downeyville, but she said no, she was from Twin Culvert, pointing further up the mountain, saying they had been walking for a long time. I offered her the rest of my cigarettes, telling her I would buy more in Downeyville. She seemed oddly moved by this gesture. She pulled a silver cross necklace from her collar and insisted I take it. Not being religious, I refused, but she kept insisting more seriously each time. My girlfriend, sister, and friend were watching this, clearly creeped out. There was something strange about her, like she wasn't from modern times. Even when I handed her the water bottle, it seemed foreign to her. Eventually, we told her we had to leave, and she wandered back into the woods. On our way out, we looked for any sign of another camp or car in the direction she pointed to but found nothing. We returned to camp around 11:30 or midnight, had a campfire, and then went to bed around 1 a.m. At around 3 a.m., my sister, who was in a tent down the hill near the creek, said she heard something walking around on the other side of the creek. We talked back and forth for about 20 minutes. I couldn't hear much, but she was getting more and more scared, so I told her to come sleep in my tent with my girlfriend, and I would sleep in hers. I had a .45 pistol and didn't think much of it. We traded spots, and I went back to sleep in her tent. About 20 minutes later, I heard something walking around near us, very distinctly, pacing back and forth in the woods. I couldn't tell if it was a person or an animal, but it definitely wasn't a small animal. This went on for about an hour, with me falling asleep and then being woken up again. I was getting unnerved and a bit annoyed since I was trying to sleep off some beer. It kept going until I heard whatever it was start crossing the creek and coming up the embankment toward my tent. It walked right past my tent and towards our fire and my truck, which was backed up to the fire. I heard something rustling around our camp and then heard something banging on metal. I realized whatever it was trying to break into my Bronco. My first thought was that it was a bear smelling food in the truck. Now I was really freaked out. With no other option, I slowly and quietly unzipped my tent, carefully poked my head out with my gun, and looked toward my truck and the fire. To my surprise, it was a full-grown buck, horns and all, standing there, staring at the embers of our fire like it was trying to warm up. I was relieved but decided to scare it off. I hit the wall of the tent, half out of the doorway, and yelled, "Get out of here!" To my shock, the deer just turned its head, looked at me, and then back at the fire. It didn't move. I tried again, louder and more animated. This time, it slowly turned and started walking towards me, which was extremely unnerving. Deer are usually scared of people and don't approach them. At this point, I was really freaked out. It was a big buck. I quickly got back in the tent, zipped it up, and just waited. The buck walked up to the tent, and I could see its silhouette from the firelight on the tent wall. It stood there next to the entrance to my tent for a good minute or two, then continued snooping around our campsite. Eventually, it wandered off in the same direction the woman had gone. Throughout the night, I kept hearing something different from a deer moving around near the creek on the other side. I hardly got any sleep, but around 5 a.m., I must have dozed off because I was suddenly woken up by the sound of the woman on the other side of the creek, calling out, "Hello? Hello? Can you hear me? Can I have some water? I'm really thirsty." I ignored her because I was so damn tired and because it was so damn creepy. She stopped, then came back about 15 minutes later, calling out again. She did this a few times and it just weirded me out. It was just starting to get light in the sky, really early morning. We all got up, packed up, and began the 2.5-hour drive home. On the way out, I pulled off on a dirt path to see if I could spot her camp. Down an embankment, I found an old fire ring, cold as the earth, clearly not used in a while. But there were signs someone had been there recently, like Camel cigarette butts, the same brand I smoke. And then I saw something that made my blood run cold. A whole head of brownish-gray hair, like a wig that had fallen apart, just lying in the dirt where it looked like someone had been lying. It looked exactly like the woman's hair. I got back in my truck and got out of there fast. The next morning, after getting home, I went out to my truck and noticed my license plate was gone, like it had been torn off. If it had been missing at the campsite, we would have noticed. I can't help but think that whatever that deer or whatever it was that had been messing with my tailgate took it. Just weird, creepy stuff, man. I live relatively close to YNP and see it as an incredible and enchanting place. I feel extremely fortunate to be within driving distance of a location that people from around the globe come to see. Every time I've taken the opportunity to visit the park, it's been an unforgettable experience. My only regret is not visiting more frequently, but I've stayed overnight in the Yosemite Valley area twice. The first time was at housekeeping camp, where I knew the accommodations were close to others. I figured the other visitors enjoying themselves, clearly with a lot of alcohol, was okay. I don't drink and can't understand why anyone would come to such an awe-inspiring place just to get wasted, but everyone has their reasons. I was there for mine and others came for theirs, and I accepted that. Except for the people right next to me who decided to drink all night, and as often happens with alcohol, they got louder and louder until 4 a.m. They weren't obnoxious, but they were very loud, and I didn't get any quality sleep. My plans for the next day were ruined, as I was exhausted and frustrated. Then this past weekend, I stayed in Camp 4. Again, I knew the campsites were practically on top of each other, but was still hoping for the best. The group of 3 who were set up about 10 feet from our tent seemed pretty low-key. They were playing music at a low volume and just chatting. I was worn out from a long day of hiking, crawled into the tent around 8:30, and quickly fell asleep. About an hour and a half later, I woke up to hear one of the people in the trio right next to me crying hysterically, clearly drunk, loud, and sobbing like they just lost a loved one or a pet. This went on for over an hour. Finally calmed down and I fell back asleep. At about 1:30, I woke up again, to the same person literally retching and puking their guts out just outside their tent. Loudly, and they kept vomiting all night long into the next morning. It sounded like they had alcohol poisoning and probably should have packed up and gone home or to urgent care. It was that bad. I could hear their campmates trying to get this person to drink water or eat something, but they refused and just sat outside their tent puking and dry heaving. It was awful. Continued all night. I didn't get any decent rest. My plans for a full day of hiking were now ruined. But worse, I was angry. I was tired and feeling this unpleasant frustration bubbling up inside me. It was the opposite of how I wanted to feel when visiting this beautiful, magical place that brings me peace. I got up the next morning and saw that this person had vomited all over the campsite. I put off eating anything, not surprising, and packed up everything to leave as early as possible. As we were leaving, this person was still making awful noises and hanging their head out of the tent. Other campers from nearby sites came over and offered first, some anti-nausea medicine, and second, coffee and food, both of which were refused. Is the valley always full of drunk idiots? Or do I just have the worst luck? I won't stay in the valley again. I drove over to Tioga Pass and checked out Tamarack Flats campground, and it looks amazing, huge spots and secluded. Maybe the silver lining in all this is that I found a much better place that I wouldn't have considered before. I thought going camping with my ex-husband might help us clear the air, maybe even bring some peace between us. We didn't split up in a huge fight, but there was always this tension that never really went away. Spending a few days in the woods together seemed like a good way to end things on a better note. The plan was simple: a quiet spot by the lake, a small campfire, and nothing but nature around us. The first day was calm. We set up the tent, gathered some firewood, and sat by the water, watching the sun slowly sink below the trees. It was quiet, almost too quiet. We both acted like everything was fine, but the silence between us was heavy. As night came, the air got colder, and I felt a chill that wasn't just from the temperature. It was like a tight feeling in my stomach, like something was wrong, but I couldn't figure out what. That night, I couldn't sleep well. Every small noise seemed louder, sharper. The rustling of leaves, the snapping of twigs. It all kept me on edge. I kept telling myself it was just the forest, that there was nothing out there. But no matter how many times I tried to reassure myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I turned over and over in my sleeping bag, trying to get comfortable, but no matter what I did, I couldn't get warm. The next morning felt different. There was this weird tension in the air, even thicker than before. We didn't talk much, just went about our business, pretending like everything was okay. But the longer we stayed out there, the more I noticed little things. The way he kept glancing at me when he thought I wasn't looking, the way he was quieter than usual, almost too quiet. It was like he was waiting for something, and I had no idea what. By the second night, that uneasy feeling grew stronger, to the point where I couldn't ignore it anymore. The forest seemed darker, the sounds more threatening. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and I felt like the darkness was closing in around us. I tried to focus on the campfire, its warmth and light, but it wasn't enough to push away the growing fear. Then, I started noticing things that made me really uncomfortable. His movements were strange, deliberate. He was poking at the fire, but his eyes kept darting toward the tent, then back to me. I couldn't figure out what he was thinking, but the look in his eyes wasn't one I recognized. There was something there, something that made my skin crawl. It wasn't exactly fear, but it was close. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I lay there, listening to the sounds outside and to his breathing next to me. I felt trapped, surrounded by darkness, with no escape. The hours dragged on, and all I could think about was getting out of there, away from him, away from whatever this was turning into. When the morning finally came, I was exhausted, but I knew I had to leave. I told him I wasn't feeling well and needed to head back early. He didn't argue, just nodded, but the way he looked at me when I said it made my heart race. There was something in his eyes, something dark, something I didn't want to face. We packed up in silence, and I kept my distance, making sure to stay close to the car. As we drove back to town, the tension didn't ease up, not even a little. If anything, it got worse. The road felt longer, the air inside the car heavier. I could feel his eyes on me even when I wasn't looking. When we finally got back, I grabbed my things and left without saying much. As soon as I was out of his sight, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, but the unease stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been wrong during that trip, something that wasn't just about us. A few days later, I found something that made my stomach drop. There was a small tear in my sleeping bag, right where my back would have been. It wasn't big, but it looked like it had been made with something sharp. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it stood out, clear as day. I tried to think back, tried to remember when it could have happened, but I couldn't. The more I thought about it, the more everything started to make sense. The way he had been acting, the looks he gave me, the silence. It wasn't just the woods that had me on edge. It was him. I had gone out there thinking it was just a simple camping trip, but now I wasn't so sure. I couldn't prove anything, couldn't say for certain what had been on his mind, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't safe with him anymore. I couldn't shake the thought of how easily things could have gone wrong out there. We were alone, far from anyone who could help. And I kept wondering, what if that small tear in my sleeping bag had been meant for more than just a scare? What if it had been a warning? A reminder that no matter how things had ended between us, there was still a dark side to him that I hadn't fully seen before? That thought still keeps me up at night, because now I know there's a part of him I don't recognize, a part that I don't think I ever will. And I can't help but wonder if that part of him is waiting for the right moment to come back, to finish what he might have started out there in the woods. That's a fear I can't shake, no matter how much I try to convince myself that it's over, because deep down I know it's not. I was always close to my sister-in-law, Sarah. We got along great, and our families spent a lot of weekends together. So when she suggested a weekend camping trip, I thought it was a good idea. We figured it would be a good way to get away from work stress and the noise of the city. I had been camping before, but this time felt different. I couldn't shake a weird feeling that something was wrong. We picked a spot deep in the woods, far from any town. The drive up was nice, the trees getting thicker as we went deeper into the forest. The campsite was beautiful, right by a small, clear lake. We set up our tents, gathered some firewood, and settled in for what we thought would be a relaxing night. The first night was calm. We cooked over the fire, told stories, and laughed until we were too tired to stay awake. But the next day, I started noticing things that didn't seem right. First, it was small stuff. The sounds of the forest seemed too quiet, like the usual rustling of leaves and animal noises had stopped. Then, as we sat by the lake, I noticed footprints along the shore that weren't ours. They were fresh, leading out of the water and disappearing into the trees. I didn't say anything to Sarah because I didn't want to freak her out, but I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. They were big, too big to be a normal person's. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but that uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. Later that night, as we sat by the fire again, I heard something in the distance, a low, deep sound like a growl. It was faint, but it made me freeze. Sarah didn't seem to hear it, or if she did, she didn't react. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear far off in the woods, but the feeling that something was wrong only got stronger. When we finally went to bed, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound outside made me jump. The wind through the trees, the crack of a branch, the rustling of leaves. It all seemed louder, closer. I lay in my tent, staring up at the darkness, listening, waiting for something, anything. Then I heard it again, that growl, closer this time, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. I sat up, my heart racing. The footsteps were coming from just outside the tent. They were slow, careful, like whatever was out there didn't want to be heard. I held my breath, trying to listen. The footsteps circled the tent, then stopped right at the entrance. I could hear heavy breathing, deep and rough, like something big was just inches away. I wanted to scream, to wake Sarah, but I was too scared to move. The breathing went on for what felt like forever. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The footsteps slowly moved away, fading into the night. I didn't dare move until the first light of morning. When the sun finally came up, I rushed out of the tent. The ground outside was messed up, with large prints pressed deep into the dirt, leading from the tent back into the woods. I woke Sarah, and we packed up as fast as we could, not saying a word to each other. We left the campsite as quickly as possible, neither of us looking back. On the drive home, the silence between us was heavy. We both knew something had been out there, something watching us. We never spoke about what happened that night, but we never went camping again. The fear of whatever was in those woods, of what we might have run into, was enough to keep us far away from the wilderness. To this day, I still think about those footsteps, that breathing, and wonder what was out there. What if we hadn't left when we did? What if it had decided to come into the tent? I'll never know, but I don't need to. The thought of what could have happened is enough to keep me from ever going back. But the thing that still haunts me, the thing I can't forget, is that those footprints didn't just come from the woods. They led back into the lake. Whatever was out there, it came from the water. And now, every time I see a quiet lake, I wonder what might be lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for its next chance to come ashore. I've always liked the peace of camping. Being out in the wild by myself makes me feel free. This time, I planned to camp for a few days alone, so I found a quiet spot near a small lake deep in the woods. The only sign of other people was a tent set up a few hundred yards away. A man I had met earlier called himself my neighbor in the wild. He seemed friendly, a bit older, wearing faded camouflage clothes, and he mentioned that he used to be in the military, a retired commander. The first day went by without any trouble. I spent the morning setting up my camp, gathering firewood, and getting ready for a quiet evening under the stars. As the sun started to set, I noticed my neighbor standing by the water, staring out at nothing. There was something odd about the way he stood, stiff, almost like he was waiting for something. The next morning, I woke up to find him gone. His tent was still there, but he was nowhere to be seen. At first, I didn't worry. People often head out early to hike or fish. But as the day went on and he didn't come back, I started to feel uneasy. The air felt heavy, and the forest was unusually quiet. I tried to focus on my own tasks, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. By the time night came, he still hadn't returned. I thought about packing up and leaving, but it didn't feel right to just leave without knowing what had happened. So, I decided to walk over to his campsite and check things out. His tent was zipped shut, everything neatly packed away like he hadn't planned to be gone for long. I walked around his campsite, calling out, but there was only silence. That's when I noticed something strange. A small patch of disturbed dirt not far from his tent. It looked like someone had been digging there recently, but the dirt had been hastily covered up. My heart started to race, and I felt panic rising, but I tried to stay calm. I found a stick and started to dig. As I cleared away the dirt, I uncovered a shallow pit. Inside were a few items: a knife, a worn dog tag, and a notebook. The dog tag had a name on it I didn't recognize, but it was the notebook that caught my attention. I flipped through it and saw page after page filled with notes about survival skills, old military missions, and, strangely, entries about this very camping trip. The last entry made my blood run cold. It described how he'd been following a man who matched my description. It talked about how he was planning to eliminate the target, because the mission wasn't finished. There was no name, but the description was too close to mine. His paranoia, his obsession with this mission, had made him believe I was some kind of enemy. I froze, the forest suddenly feeling too quiet, too close. That's when I heard a twig snap behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. I was alone in the clearing, but I could feel eyes on me. My mind raced. He was out there somewhere, watching me, waiting for the right moment. He might have been ex-military, but something had clearly snapped in his mind, and he'd decided I was the enemy. I didn't stick around to find out what he planned to do. I dropped the notebook and ran back to my camp. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, my hands shaking. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting him to show up at any moment, but he never did. The only sounds were my racing heartbeat and the rustling leaves in the wind. I left the forest that night, driving nonstop until I was miles away. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, his twisted sense of duty pushing him to complete a mission that never existed. As I lie awake at night, I can still picture him, standing by the lake, waiting, and I can't help but wonder if he's found a new target, or if one day he'll track me down again. I know I should forget about it, but there's something in the way he looked at me, something that tells me this isn't over. Maybe it's just paranoia, or maybe it's the truth, that he's still out there searching and that I'll never truly be safe. I decided to take my kids camping for the weekend while my husband was away on a business trip. It was just me and the two of them, hoping to create some memories together. We found a quiet spot at a small campground by a lake. It was only a couple of hours from home, so it seemed like the perfect place. Safe and close enough to get to easily, but still far enough to feel like an adventure. The first day went smoothly. We set up the tent, roasted marshmallows, and the kids had a blast splashing around in the lake. It felt great to be out of the usual routine. As night came, I tucked the kids into their sleeping bags and sat by the fire, enjoying the calm. The stars were bright, and the fire crackled softly. Everything was peaceful, and I began to unwind. The campground was small, and from what I could see, there weren't many other people there. A few tents were scattered around, but it felt like we had the place mostly to ourselves. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. The kids were sound asleep, and the fire had burned down to just glowing embers. I crawled into the tent, zipped it up, and lay down beside them. In the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. I wasn't sure why at first. Everything was quiet, except for the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. Then I heard it, a faint crunching sound, like someone walking on gravel. I froze and listened carefully. The sound was slow and deliberate, and it seemed to be getting closer to the tent. My heart started racing. I thought it might be an animal, but the footsteps were too heavy and too controlled. I reached out to check the kids, making sure they were still asleep. I didn't want to wake them up and frighten them. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent. I could hear someone or something breathing slowly and heavily, almost as if they were trying to stay unnoticed. My mind raced. I had no way to see who or what was outside without making noise, and there was no easy escape. I felt completely trapped. I stayed perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. The minutes dragged on, feeling like hours. The person outside started moving again, walking around the tent and dragging their feet. I could see a shadow shifting through the tent fabric as they moved. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. The breathing, the footsteps, everything went silent. I strained my ears, waiting, but heard nothing. I didn't dare move even though my body was tense and sore. At some point, I must have fallen asleep. When I woke up, it was morning. The sun was just coming up, and the kids were still fast asleep beside me. I quietly unzipped the tent and looked outside. There was no one around, but the ground was disturbed. It looked like someone had been walking in circles around our tent all night. We packed up quickly as soon as the kids were awake. I didn't say anything to them. I didn't want to scare them. But as we drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had been watched. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following us. Even now, I still can't forget that night. The way those footsteps circled us, getting closer and closer. And what chills me the most is the thought that whoever was out there might still be watching, waiting for the next chance to get closer. Since then, I haven't taken the kids camping again. I can't get rid of the feeling that whatever was out there is still lurking, just beyond the edge of the light. I had been looking forward to this camping trip with my son for weeks. We set up our tent by a small, quiet lake surrounded by thick woods, far from other campsites. It was supposed to be a weekend escape, just the two of us, away from the noise and stress of daily life. The first day was perfect. We spent our time fishing and cooking over the campfire. As night came, the forest was alive with the sounds of crickets and the occasional rustle of animals in the bushes. I felt satisfied as I watched my son fall asleep in his sleeping bag. Around midnight, I woke up to a weird noise. It was a soft, steady tapping coming from outside the tent. At first, I tried to ignore it, thinking it might be a branch moving in the wind. But the tapping got louder and seemed to come from different directions. I quietly unzipped the tent and went outside, trying to find the source of the sound. Under the moonlight, the forest looked eerie. I walked a few steps away from the tent and saw nothing unusual, just the dark shapes of the trees. I thought it was just the wind and went back to bed. But the tapping didn't stop, kept going all night and seemed to get closer each time. The next morning, I looked around the campsite. There were no signs of animals or other people, just the same quiet forest. We decided to go for a hike, hoping to distract myself from the strange noises. When we got back to the campsite in the evening, everything seemed fine at first. I started cooking dinner while my son played by the water. As I looked up, I saw something odd on the tent. There were small, muddy handprints smeared on the fabric, about the size of a child's hand. A chill ran down my spine. I checked around the tent but found no footprints or other signs of anyone being there. I tried to think of it as a prank or maybe a stray animal. But as night fell, the tapping started again. This time, it was louder and more urgent, as if someone was trying to get inside. I decided we would leave early the next morning. I stayed awake all night, sitting by the fire and watching the tent. The tapping continued, and I heard occasional scurrying sounds near the tent, but I never saw anything. At dawn, we packed up quickly and drove home. Once we were back, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. Later, I found out that other campers nearby had reported similar noises and even sightings of strange figures in the woods. No one could explain what was happening, but it made me realize we weren't alone out there. Looking back, I felt a mix of relief and lingering fear. We had narrowly escaped a much worse situation. The trip, which had started as a simple father-son adventure, ended with a chilling reminder that the woods hold more secrets than we understand. The strange tapping and the muddy handprints were never explained, and they left a lasting mark on my memory. Sometimes, when I think back, I wonder what was out there in the dark, just beyond the edge of our campsite, waiting and watching.